Today's video is sponsored by Skillshare.
Hey guys, it's Danny. Today we are talking all about big, beautiful orchids, but not like in the sense of tall or big sized, but in the sense of bushy. The more bushy, quote unquote, an orchid is, the more blooms it can produce. And in the end, we can end up with a ball of beautiful, gorgeous flowers if we know what we're doing. They are the so-called specimen-sized orchids. So today I'm gonna give you some tips about them. We talked about them many years ago as well. I'm gonna show you some tricks to obtain a specimen faster and just talk a little bit about it. Today's video is not necessarily meant for beginners, but more for intermediate growers. If you're a beginner, you can absolutely watch this video, but I wouldn't suggest you start chopping your orchids just because I said so. Just get a little bit more experience first, because you know what? We learn every single day. I don't know about you guys, but no matter how good I think I am at something, I always tend to learn something new. So be patient with this. And speaking about learning, while you're waiting to gather more experience with orchids, why not give Skillshare a shot?
And one of the best ways to learn something new from actual industry experts is to join Skillshare, the largest online learning community for people that are curious and hungry for learning new skills. Here you'll find thousands of creative classes in countless categories such as decorating, design, illustration, photography, music, and so much more. You guys know I'm so close to moving to my new house. And it's so exciting, but kind of scary at the same time, because you know, I don't have an eye for design and decorating, and there will be a lot of decorating involved. So I searched on Skillshare for some classes that would help me decorate my house. But where do I start? Well, Skillshare has this new feature called Learning Paths. They are curated class collections related to the topic of your interest. So not only did I find classes on interior design, but also classes about sewing my own cushions. You guys, I want to design my own orchid cushions. I really loved Ellie Shipman's class on illustrated textiles, design, print, and sew a cushion. I was thinking to get my own small sewing machine for years now. So this class ties into one of my wishes that I've never had the motivation to pick up. This class gave me the guideline and motivation I needed to take this to the next level and make it a reality. But the best part is you can try Skillshare for free today. The first 500 of you to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial on Skillshare to browse through all of their courses and see if it's for you. Nothing to lose, only to gain. So check out the description and also the pinned comment for the Skillshare link. And in the end, thank you all for supporting the people who support me.
But let's presume that you did your courses on Skillshare and you're not a beginner with orchids and you're interested to know how you can obtain those beautiful, massive orchids full of blooms that you might see on Instagram. Well, it's not as hard as you'd think, and you don't necessarily need to wait as long as you'd think. So today's video will focus mainly on sympodial orchids such as cattleyas, oncidiums, dendrobiums, not so much on monopodials such as vandas and phalaenopsis, because the results in my opinion are not as showy, but I will address a little bit monopodials as well. It's just gonna be shorter. So let's start with monopodials actually. Let's get an orchid. Alright, so in the beginning of this video I said that the bushier an orchid is, the more flowers it can produce. How can we make phalaenopsis bushy? Does this mean more leaves? No, not necessarily. Here's the difference between the sympodials and the monopodials. Sympodials have a rhizome which grows pseudobulbs constantly. And the pseudobulbs it grows, they don't die off. They can linger for years upon years. So the older an orchid gets, the longer the rhizome, the more pseudobulbs, the bushier it gets, right? Well, monopodials don't grow like that. They have a central stem, not a rhizome, and they don't put out pseudobulbs, they have leaves. So making something like this bushy is not the same. But we can obtain a bigger inflorescence on these orchids, provided we give the good care and all of those things, by simply making a community pot. And this is something we discussed in the past as well. If we have multiple monopodial orchids in one pot, obviously each of those orchids will produce 1 to 3 or 4 flower spikes. So we will have a grander show. Now with phalaenopsis, I will say I personally don't really do it because I don't like the look as much, but I do have a few mini phalaenopsis that have some basil keikis, so pretty much there are multiple plants in one pot. And of course the flower show is really great. Now in my experience, you won't have issues with each plant fighting for resources as long as you provide good resources. They don't seem to release any substances to like eliminate the competition of sorts. Nothing like that. What I would suggest though, to make a story short, is that you always pot together orchids that have the same requirements. For example, if we pot together a Phalaenopsis and a Vanda, things will not be good for either of them because the Phalaenopsis is low light and needs a cool down. A Vanda is hot growing and needs high light. So where do we place this orchid in the house, right? So when you're making a community pot, make sure your orchids are either the same type. You can buy multiple Phalaenopsis that look the same and put them together, and you know, at a glance it won't look like multiple orchids, it's just gonna look like multiple flower spikes, and I find that the most appealing. But you can pot multiple Phalaenopsis of different kinds together as well. I'm not a fan of that, but you know, it's not necessarily wrong. You don't have issues with them like fighting each other necessarily. It will just get very cramped. You'll probably need a very big pot because each orchid can produce a lot of roots, but I mean, if the flower show is worth it, why not? You can absolutely play with it, you can absolutely do it. When you repot, it might be a little bit tricky, but it's absolutely doable. So that's how we can get a big specimen out of a Phalaenopsis. Phalaenopsis, yes, they grow older, they make leaves, and they bloom better the older they are, but we cannot work in the same way as with the sympodials. Have you ever seen on Instagram, I don't remember the account, but I will definitely share it with you down below because you have to see this. There is a grower that has a lot of space, but also specimen-sized Cattleya orchids. They're ginormous. They're absolutely beautiful. A Phalaenopsis, we cannot get it necessarily like that because we need to plant multiple orchids together. So if you find a way with multiple baskets to put multiple Phalaenopsis in one place, that's how you will get that effect. But with monopodials, it's not that easy. Vanda orchids are slightly easier because they do tend to have sometimes a more compact growth depending on the Vanda. This is a Neophonetia hybrid. Now it's called a Vanda. So something like this, you know, easier to make a sort of specimen out of this one, but again, it will not necessarily, to my eyes, look as good as a sympodial. With the sympodials is where we're gonna, you know, get into the magical stuff. But just so you know, with monopodials, you can definitely pot them together, make your community pots. I would suggest you go with the same type of orchid for maximum effect, right? If you have like a white orchid or a purple orchid and this orchid together, it's not gonna look like a bushy orchid or like a massive inflorescence. It's just gonna look like 3 orchids potted together. If that's the look you're going for, great. But if it's not, you know, depends what you want. And that goes for most other monopodials we can grow. So with that said, let's put the monopodials back and get to the fun part. Sympodials. These are the ones with the most potential. As I was saying, they have a rhizome, which I think it's a little clearer on this orchid. They have a rhizome that continuously grows and creates growth after growth, which can bloom. Now, the downside of sympodials is that once a pseudobulb is spent, meaning it bloomed, or it's old and it didn't bloom in a couple of years, it will never bloom again. So it's just gonna stay on the orchid and not produce flowers. That's a downside, but it's not a downside because sympodials can be divided, and those older growths, they do still have dormant eyes and they can be awakened. So we can get new growths off of the older growths that already bloomed, or they didn't bloom but they're not gonna bloom because they're too old. So the first way in which we can bushen up an orchid to get more flowers is to divide it. And I do have a separate video on division if, again, you're a beginner, you don't know much about division. I'll link it to it down below, but let's presume you already know how to divide orchids safely and properly. You can divide an orchid in multiple pieces and then pot those pieces together. In the end, as the orchid grows, you will not be able to tell that there are multiple pieces potted together. What will happen is each of those pieces will create a new lead from one of the dormant eyes. So let's say you have one direction of growth, you have one new pseudobulb per year, let's say. Imagine I cut the rhizome of this one into 2. I will instantly get another lead from the back, which will create another direction of growth, which will continue to grow as an individual plant because it's disconnected from the mother plant. If I leave them together in the same pot, these two leads will continuously grow amongst each other. They will not fight each other. They will not release substances to annihilate the competition or anything of the sorts. They do not do that, in my experience. And I do have quite a lot of experience with this dividing and putting orchids together. Now, in order to do this, we need to have a fairly older orchid, obviously, because we need a longer rhizome. Now, these orchids can start to wake up eyes on their own. Some of them do it more than others. Now, these two, they simply did not wake up any other eyes in the past. Like this one has a round like rhizome. The rhizome did this because I kind of trained it with the light. But they don't have branching rhizomes, as it were, because they're just not prone to it. But there are some hybrids which are, such as the Brassavola hybrids, and this is the Golden Peacock. Currently I have 3, potentially 4 leads on this orchid, and I sadly broke one of the leads when I repotted this orchid. But anyway, Brassavola hybrids, especially the Brassavola nodosa hybrids, not so much the cucullata, I notice, but the Brassavola nodosa hybrids are very eager to branch out, quote unquote, as it were. So even if you don't pot multiple divisions in one pot, they can branch out on their own the older they get. But if you just want to skip like the older they get part, or you just have one of these orchids that doesn't branch out on its own, you can simply divide the orchid in divisions of, let's say, minimum 3 pseudobulbs, and then pot all of those divisions together. And again, I will link you the division videos down below, because there are a few rules that you should keep in mind. A second way in which we can bushen up a sympodial orchid is to not necessarily divide it, but divide it nonetheless. What do I mean by this? Well, you don't necessarily need to unpot the orchid. You can cut the rhizome while the orchid is still in the same pot. Now, this takes a little bit of timing because we kind of want these growths to be timed together, which sometimes doesn't happen. With my Golden Peacock, I had some growths that were not timed. So I had one growth blooming now, and another one in 2 months, and another one in 4 months, the same one. So it was alternating. I never had like a full bushy inflorescence. So with this, you kind of need to time it. You kind of need to know when a new growth from the main lead will start to grow, and then you can cut the rhizome just to make sure that those growths are timed to grow together as close as possible. Now, this is something that I did many years ago as an experiment, and it worked out beautifully, and I will demonstrate today how to do it as well. Not sure if I want to do it on this orchid, although I want to send a division of this orchid to a very special viewer who deserves the world, but it's not timed just yet. Let me get another orchid and I'll show you how to cut the rhizome while the orchid is in the pot and the benefits of that. Hold on. Actually, I am going to demonstrate on this one. This is the Summer Beauty, because I'm not going to keep the division that I make, so I don't mind if it's not timed. They're gonna be 2 separate divisions, and it's just easier to show you because it has a straight rhizome. So what I'm gonna do is look at the rhizome, of course, and try to make a division of at least 3 pseudobulbs. If it's awkward to cut, like every 3 pseudobulbs, just pick 4 pseudobulbs, or pick somewhere, a place that is easy to cut. You don't want to massacre the orchid, okay? Right, so what I will do now is assess a little bit the situation and see where it's going to be easiest to cut. So I'm gonna have a division with 3 mature pseudobulbs and a division with 4. Yes. Right, so I'm gonna take a sanitized pair of pruners. Let's sanitize it again, because I don't know when I did last. Right, so I'm gonna go right here where the rhizome is. You can remove some of the sheets if they're in the way and you cannot really properly see where you cut. Just remove these sheets. The base of the pseudobulb is right here. We're not gonna cut into it. We're gonna cut close to this pseudobulb. So we're gonna go and just make a very clean cut. It's a thick rhizome. There we go. Oh, I'm stuck. Let me see if I cut through. Yes, I have. The rhizome is split, it's cut. This division is now separate from this division, but I will not remove it from the pot. Now, the benefit of this is we will make sure that this growth will be not sit back, extra sit back, because the roots that this side still has in the pot, they will survive. And this is a very good technique for Cattleya orchids, which have very sensitive roots. When we repot Cattleyas, chances are most of the roots will not make it because they're just so sensitive to being bothered and scratched and damaged during repotting. So what we want actually is to repot this when the new growth produces roots. If I were to just unpot everything, make the division, put it, let's say, in a little container with sphagnum moss, this being the type of orchid that has slow growth, one growth a year, it will take so many months for the new growth to appear and for the new roots to appear that this section might get depleted and might die off. And I've had it happen. So if I leave it here in the pot without disturbing the roots, both of these divisions will be absolutely fine. I just disconnected them to wake up, another eye, but the roots are perfectly fine. So obviously, if we're gonna have another direction of growth on this side, we're magically going to have two directions of growth on our orchid. I intend to give away this division, but you don't have to give it away. You can leave it in the pot, let it live there, and watch how you suddenly have a bushier orchid. Now, you can do this procedure even if your orchid is already semi-bushy, you have maybe a few directions of growth. If you have a long rhizome, which you can cut, then cut it. If you cannot make necessarily divisions of like 3 pseudobulbs in a row, but you have like a sort of a triangle or something, again, you can cut it. Just make sure you do not leave any division that is like doubtful that it's gonna make it. Maybe it's very, very old. The older the growth, the less likely it is to produce or to wake up any of the eyes. So if you have very tiny seedling growth, that one will not do anything. Don't cut it to leave like 3 pseudobulbs. Most likely will not do anything. Leave that older growth maybe with a couple of bigger pseudobulbs. Anyway, you can play around with this, and it's the safest method of quote-unquote dividing or bushioning up your orchid. It is perfect for Cattleya orchids, which are just so sensitive, and maybe oncidiums as well. With oncidiums, you can actually use a knife. I used a shear because the rhizome on mine was pretty thick and I couldn't use the knife and I had space. But if you have pseudobulbs very tight to each other, you could try to use a knife. Anyway, make sure you do not cut the base of the pseudobulb. You make sure you identify the rhizome correctly and it's gonna work out beautifully. And method number 3, or trick number 3, is to create a fake specimen, which I have an entire video on. A few years ago, I created a fake Cattleya type specimen. I'll put it down below if you want to watch the video. It looked beautiful. But what I did was I didn't purchase. My husband purchased me one and he didn't know I already had one. I had 2 Cattleya type orchids of the very same kind. So I thought, well, I'm gonna pot them together, and hey presto, I have twice the orchid with twice the blooming capabilities. So just like with the community potting of the Phalaenopsis, you can actually community pot a sympodial orchid as well, and you won't even notice there are 2 orchids there. So you can cheat. I call it the fake specimen, but hey, it's absolutely fine. Why not? And as it grows and the roots intertwine, at some point they will just be so stuck together you cannot even detach them anymore. It will merge pretty much into one orchid. But that is the way, or the ways that I know of, that are safe and are sure to bushen up your orchid if that's what you want. The benefits: you have a much greater show when it's time to bloom. The downsides: it will take a lot of space. Hence why I typically try to have only a few specimen-sized orchids, and I typically go for the ones that don't have very big leaves, so that I can get away with like 100 growths in the space of like 50 or 20 of one of these. So it's more economical with space and it has more blooming potential. And I would recommend Brassavola hybrids. They have fast growth, they can just split on their own as well, and they are just easier to grow with less demanding needs, less light or bright light, less warmth. They have continuous growth. The faster it grows, the faster you'll get a specimen and a bushy plant, right? So those are my recommendations, but of course you can play around with this and enjoy whatever orchid you feel like. Now, there might be other ways of bushening up your orchid, but either I don't find efficient, like any boosters and such, any root hormones and such, I don't use because I do not find efficient, That's totally up to you if you want to use, but I don't recommend wasting money on it. And other methods, I don't know, some might be viable, but I just don't know about them at this given time, or I cannot think about them. But I do think this is enough to set you on your road to having a specimen plant. Now, if you want the reverse somehow, since we're at the end of the video, if you want to keep an orchid smaller, I do have a video on that as well, because that is something that I do as well, just to conserve space. Sometimes I don't want a bushy orchid, but I do still want the orchid. What I do is I cut the older growth, or I make divisions and I keep one of the divisions and the rest I give them away. I'll link you to the video down below if you have some time and want to watch that too. But for today, that is about it. Hope you've enjoyed today's topic, and if you didn't know about these tricks, there we go. We learn all the time, and I'm sure I will learn some more tricks as I grow orchids. And speaking about learning, thank you Skillshare for sponsoring this video. And with that said, I hope you'll have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Bye!